Welcome to This Day in History, created by American Heritage Worldwide, a reminder that every day holds something new to learn. Did you know that William Penn was arrested and spent time in the Tower of London for wanting to promote fairness, peace, and religious freedom? Learn that while in prison, Penn wrote a book called No Cross, No Crown. And when King Charles II gave Penn 45,000 square miles of land to pay a debt to his father, Penn used this land to create the colony of Pennsylvania as a place to practice his religious beliefs and establish the Holy Experiment. Imagine being locked in a dungeon by the government.
Right.
Specifically for being a radical extremist.
Yeah, not exactly a comfortable position to be in.
Not at all. But now imagine that same government suddenly, handing you a piece of land the size of England to run as your own private kingdom.
It is honestly a historical real estate transfer that just defies every predictable script of how wealth and power normally operate.
Exactly. And that's exactly what we're getting into. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we have a massive stack of historical texts, records, and excerpts, all detailing the life of William Penn.
Yes, the architect of what he called his holy experiment.
Right. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to figure out this wild trajectory.
We're dissecting a really profound transformation here. These documents show how a defiant, repeatedly arrested teenager actually became the world's largest non-royal landowner.
Which is just a crazy title to hold.
It really is. But more importantly, the facts map out how his specific, really radical religious convictions laid the absolute factual groundwork for the United States Constitution.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are looking at a central paradox that just demands a serious explanation.
Right, the obvious contradiction.
Yeah, how does a man imprisoned in the Tower of London end up getting handed 45,000 square miles of America by King Charles II?
To understand the sheer absurdity of that transaction, you really have to start with the teenager rotting in a jail cell.
So take us back there. What puts him in that cell?
Well, the genesis of that jail cell is rooted entirely in a super volatile family dynamic. The clash between William Penn and his father is basically the engine for this entire historical shift.
And his dad wasn't just anybody, right?
Oh, no. His father, Sir William Penn, was an English admiral. He was a highly influential politician who sat in the House of Commons from 1660 to 1670. The man was deeply embedded in the machinery of the state.
So you have a man firmly entrenched in the political establishment, a guy of significant social standing who naturally had, very specific, highly respectable hopes for his son.
Exactly. He wanted the younger Penn to attend the prestigious Oxford University and just follow a traditional, powerful path within the Church of England.
But things didn't exactly go to plan.
No, not at all. At age 15, the younger Penn experienced a complete ideological awakening that just totally derailed those establishment plans.
What happened?
He heard a Quaker missionary named Thomas Lew speak. And Lew talked about this concept called the light of indwelling of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
Yeah, and Penn later recalled this profound moment in his own writings. He literally stated, "The Lord visited me and gave me divine impressions of himself."
Divine impressions of himself. That's a heavy paradigm-shifting concept for a 15-year-old.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think we need to establish why this specific religious pivot frustrated his father so intensely. Joining the Quakers in the 17th century, it wasn't just some, quirky spiritual phase a teenager goes through.
Far from it. The Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers, they were viewed as an active, dangerous threat to the British crown.
A literal threat to the state.
Yeah, because they fundamentally rejected the hierarchy of the era. They refused to swear oaths of loyalty to the king because their allegiance was to God alone.
Right.
They refused to pay tithes to the state-sponsored church. And furthermore, they were strict pacifists. They would not take up arms to defend or expand the empire.
So you can see why the state hated them. And that ideological threat totally explains the sheer volume of his arrests. The younger Penn was thrown in jail many, many times for his beliefs.
He was. But, he possessed a massive safety net that other persecuted Quakers just did not have.
A powerful dad.
Exactly. His father continually used his political influence to basically bail his son out of jail. The father is desperately trying to protect the family's aristocratic reputation, just quietly pulling strings behind the scenes.
While the son is just becoming more and more vocal about his radical theology,
Right.
it feels incredibly modern, actually. Like, imagine the child of a wealthy, high-profile politician constantly getting arrested at underground protests
Oh,
today.
it's the exact same dynamic.
The dad just keeps calling the police chief, quietly getting the kid out of a holding cell to avoid a media scandal. Until, and this is the crazy part, the kid dramatically turns to their powerful father and explicitly tells him to stop the rescue missions.
Yeah, so they can become a true martyr for the cause,
Right.
and which is verbatim what happens in the historical record. Penn finally urges his father, quote, "I entreat thee not to purchase my liberty."
Wow.
He is actively choosing the brutal consequences of his beliefs over the comfortable immunity of his privilege.
And those consequences hit their absolute peak in 1668, right?
They do. He's 22 years old, officially a member of the Religious Society of Friends, and he utterly refuses to deny his conscience. So the state decides to make an example of him.
They throw him into the Tower of London.
Yes, for 8 months. Just assuming the isolation, the damp cold, and the very real fear of execution will finally break his resolve.
I mean, the guards certainly operated under that assumption. The records show they handed him a pen and paper in his cell, fully expecting a formal written retraction of his faith. They just wanted this embarrassing ordeal swept under the rug.
But he doesn't write a retraction.
No, he uses that pen to write a masterpiece of Christian literature instead. He drafts No Cross, No Crown, which is a text arguing that suffering for your beliefs is the only path to true spiritual authority.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this crucible of imprisonment in the tower is exactly what forged Penn's lifelong, unbreakable stance against forced religion.
He realized you can't beat belief into someone.
Exactly. He realized state-sanctioned violence could never dictate inner conviction. He articulated this perfectly in a letter to Lord Arlington, written directly from his cell. He wrote, "Force may make hypocrites, but it can make no converts."
Force may make hypocrites, but it can make no converts. That is such a powerful line.
It really distills his entire philosophy.
Yeah, like you can torture someone into claiming they agree with you to save their own skin, but you haven't actually changed their heart. You've just mandated a lie.
And when he was finally released, he took that hard-won conviction and spent his post-prison life arguing on behalf of thousands of persecuted Quakers who, frankly, didn't have a wealthy father to fall back on.
Right.
He wrote extensively, exhorting believers to adhere to the primitive Christianity preached by Jesus and the apostles. He was basically trying to strip away all the institutional political control that the state had layered on top of faith.
Okay, I am tracking with the ideological evolution here, but I have a massive logistical question for you.
Sure, court.
We have an anti-establishment radical who the state literally locked up for subversive beliefs.
Right.
How does a man like that suddenly get handed a massive swath of the New World by the king himself? Like, state enemies usually get the guillotine, not a continent.
It's crazy, I know. But it comes down to the mechanics of a spectacularly timed, inherited IOU.
Wait. You are saying King Charles II of Great Britain gave away a territory larger than Ireland over a financial debt?
Yes. And what's fascinating here is the sheer pragmatism of the crown.
How so?
Well, in early 1681, the king granted Penn 45,000 square miles of land along the North Atlantic coast strictly as payment for a massive sum he owed to Penn's deceased father, the admiral.
That is just unbelievable. The father who spent his life frustrated by his son's radicalism dies. The king owes his estate a fortune, and Charles II settles the ledger by handing the radical son a staggering amount of America.
Yeah. And this single transaction made William Penn the largest non-royal landowner in the entire world.
But why land? Why not just pay the money?
Well, look at the underlying motivation for why the king agreed to this specific real estate transfer. The crown was heavily in debt, so granting free land in America solved a looming financial crisis without draining the royal treasury.
Oh, okay.
But it also solved a massive political headache. It provided a perfect excuse to export thousands of radical, disruptive Quakers across the ocean, far away from the streets of London.
Oh, wow. So it's a 2-for-1 deal for the monarchy. The king clears his debt and exiles his political dissidents in one stroke.
Exactly. Though he inadvertently funded the very ideals he had been persecuting.
Yeah, that backfired wonderfully because Penn certainly didn't view this merely as a profitable land acquisition, did he?
Not at all. He saw it as a providential opportunity. He used this massive grant to establish the colony of Pennsylvania between 1681 and 1683, launching what he termed his holy experiment.
The holy experiment. I mean, it is one thing to write philosophical tracts about freedom while sitting in a dungeon. It is an entirely different beast to actually govern a massive territory.
Oh, completely.
How do you take the abstract concept of an inner light and turn it into functional, enforceable laws?
He had to transition from a marginalized critic of the state to the actual architect of a new society. And to achieve this, he drafted a Charter of Liberties for the settlement.
I've been looking at the details of this charter in our sources, and I keep thinking of it like an open source operating system for a new civilization.
I like that analogy.
Right, because Penn essentially wrote the foundational code, but then he immediately handed the admin rights over to the users.
That is a really highly accurate way to frame his legal strategy. He built a systemic framework that formally guaranteed a free trial by jury, absolute freedom of religion, and free elections.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Just think about human history. When a single individual is given absolute dictatorial power over 45,000 square miles, what is the very first thing they usually do?
They build fortresses, they consolidate power.
Exactly, they declare themselves a monarch. But Penn is handed total proprietary control, and his immediate reflex is to disperse that power to the people.
Because his theology demanded that dispersal of power. He was laying down legal principles that directly inspired the United States Constitution a century later.
He inherently understood that you cannot build a free society using authoritarian tools.
Right.
I do have to push back on the practicality of this, though, because if Penn is a pacifist Quaker who strictly opposes state violence, how on earth is he planning to maintain order?
That's a fair question.
Let alone defend this massive territory from rival empires or internal uprisings. You cannot run a functional state purely on good vibes and philosophy.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
And he addressed that exact tension by grounding his political theory in strict moral frameworks. He argued that the process of governing was entirely inseparable from the outcome.
What do you mean by that?
Well, in his work, Some Fruits of Solitude, he laid out his philosophy. He wrote, "A good end cannot sanctify evil means, nor must we do evil that good may come of it. To do evil that good may come of it is for bunglers in politics as well as morals."
Bunglers in politics as well as morals. I love that phrasing. He is completely rejecting the Machiavellian idea that the ends justify the means.
Yes, completely.
If you use tyranny and oppression to enforce peace, you have already destroyed the very peace you claim to be protecting.
Precisely. And he tied this political theory directly back to a higher authority. He believed that human governance was a divine responsibility. He wrote, "If thou wouldst rule well, thou must rule for God. Those who will not be governed by God will be ruled by tyrants."
So it's an internal thing.
Yeah, he was asserting that an internal moral compass is the only actual safeguard against authoritarianism. If the populace lacks an inner ethical law, an external tyrant will inevitably step in to enforce order through violence.
So he was trying to prove that a society could function on mutual moral consent rather than state-sponsored coercion. It is just an incredibly sophisticated blueprint for democracy.
It really is.
But history has a funny way of remembering its most brilliant architects, doesn't it? Society often takes these deeply complex revolutionary figures and just flattens them out into bizarre folklore.
Oh, absolutely. The transition from the actual man to the mythological figure is jarring. William Penn died in 1718 in Berkshire, England. His family actually retained ownership of Pennsylvania all the way up until the American Revolution. But how his legacy was memorialized is just a fascinating study in contrasts.
Let's take the physical monuments, for example. In 1894, Philadelphia hoisted a massive statue of William Penn to the very top of City Hall. We are talking about a 36-foot-tall, 53,000-pound bronze titan looking down over the metropolis.
It completely dominated the skyline. It served as a literal towering reminder of his influence over the region he founded.
And there was even this decades-long gentleman's agreement among developers that no architect would design a building higher than Penn's hat.
Right, an unspoken rule of respect.
But, commercial progress eventually ignores gentlemen's agreements. In the late 1980s, a skyscraper called One Liberty Place shattered that invisible ceiling, becoming the first of several buildings to rise higher than the founder.
So the physical skyline evolved, but the cultural memory of Penn evolved into something even stranger. It became heavily saturated with myths that completely obscure his actual historical achievements.
Oh, the myths are wild! Let's debunk the most ubiquitous one right now. The smiling, rosy-cheeked face staring at you from the box of Quaker oats in the grocery aisle. That is not William Penn.
No. And the cereal makers have explicitly confirmed it.
Really?
Yeah, it is just a generic, friendly character meant to evoke the perceived wholesomeness and integrity of the Quaker faith, and have absolutely zero factual connection to the man who sat shivering in the Tower of London.
But the general public just assumes it is him. And that brings us to an even more persistent piece of folklore. The Great Treaty.
Right, the famous elm tree story.
Yeah, the legend goes that Penn met with the Shakamaksan Indians under a massive elm tree, supposedly paying them 1,200 English pounds for their land. Sounds like a perfect, harmonious founding myth.
The problem is, the historical sources confirm it is entirely fabricated.
Wait, really? The whole thing?
The whole thing. That specific treaty, under that specific tree, for that specific amount of money, it never actually occurred.
Yet it is so deeply baked into the American consciousness that this fictional event is literally commemorated on a plaque right now at the United States Capitol.
It's crazy, but it just reveals how eager society is to consume a neat, tidy narrative. We build a bronze plaque in the heart of our government for an event that didn't happen, while barely understanding the granular historical reality of how his Charter of Liberties established the factual foundation for our entire legal system.
So what does this all mean? We reduce a man who fundamentally altered human governance into an oatmeal mascot and a fictional tree hugger.
Unfortunately, yes.
But eventually, the true weight of his intellectual impact was formally recognized, right? On November 28, 1984, President Ronald Reagan officially declared William Penn an honorary citizen of the United States.
It is a rare distinction, but a completely necessary one for a man whose intellect and personal suffering essentially drafted the blueprint for American freedom.
Let's synthesize the journey you've just been on with us today. We started with a teenage rebel who refused to conform to his powerful father's establishment expectations.
A young man who chose the brutal confines of a stone cell in the Tower of London over the betrayal of his own conscience.
And from that imprisonment, he emerged to launch a holy experiment, proving through historical fact that religious freedom, free trials by jury, and open elections could successfully govern a civilization without relying on tyranny.
He successfully bridged the gap between the radical theology of primitive Christianity and the practical, messy mechanics of a functioning democracy.
There is a quote from Penn that I think perfectly captures the urgency of his mission. He wrote, "I expect to pass through this world but once. Any good, therefore, that I can do, or any kindness or abilities that I can show to any fellow creature, let me do it now. Let me not defer it or neglect it, for I shall not pass this way again."
It aligns so well with his stark, uncompromising view of morality. He also said, right is right, even if everyone is against it, and wrong is wrong, even if everyone is for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go out your day, building on that absolute conviction.
Imagine you wake up tomorrow and the government has handed you 45,000 square miles of untouched land to start your own modern experiment in holiness. A complete blank slate to govern as you see fit.
In today's hyper-connected, deeply divided world, what is one universally accepted right in our current society that you would declare fundamentally wrong in your new colony? What rule would you impose, knowing that the process of governing is inseparable from the outcome?
It's a heavy question, but it's exactly the burden William Penn carried when he traded a jail cell for a continent. Inheriting absolute power doesn't make life easier. It just forces you to finally decide what you actually believe in. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives around you. Thank you for joining us for this day in his story. May the lessons of yesterday inspire you to see God's hand today and to play your part in his story now. For more faith-based learning, visit ahsworldwide.org, the homeschool for faith and family.